Since you used to
But
control
I really
the
do
term.
believe, and like I said, it's controversial, but I really believe that our nation will definitely massively infiltrate within the current have been massively, a lot more with Romans. I think
Do you
a lot
believe
more
the
of a
same?
Roman nation, a lot more of a Roman nation than it is.
Are you a
But-
5%
More or
off?
less,
No,
but
more or
I'm
less.
not,
What have you with the Nation of Islam?
but,
So, like a traditional Muslim.
I'm not
No, I
practicing
wouldn't say
Christian either,
I'm not like
but
a
I grew up.
more like
But you're Christian rather than Rastafari.
I wouldn't necessarily say I'm
And
Don't let the hair fall.
and so why aren't you why aren't you convinced by the Islamic arguments? Why aren't you?
She is, trust me, she's just
No, I just have to do more research into like all religions to be honest. But how I feel like they're all the same.
Yeah.
So I don't really put one above the other, but I really would do some research into them all. So I'm not convinced on anything.
okay, cool. So I want to set the table and ask you something. So Zionism and Israel specifically, explain this to me. I don't understand.
So it's one of the most misunderstood concepts amongst most, particularly Muslims. So all a Zionist is somebody that believes that the Jews have a right to self-determination in their ancestral land. So the Quran, the Christian Bibles, most archaeologists, almost all archaeologists and historians believe that the Jewish people lived in the land of Israel for a long time. In fact, we never left. And so Zionism is simply the belief that Jews have a right to a homeland there. I believe not at the expense of anyone else. So I believe that Arabs have every right to live there because many of them have lived there for a long, long time. Many of them haven't. Just like the Jews, many of them moved there in recent history. But that's Zionism in its simplest definition: is Jews have a right to a homeland there.
So you're a two-state solution Zionist.
So I am solution agnostic in the sense that any solution that ensures my people's survival, there's a big criteria for me, and lasting peace, I'm likely to back it. I want peace more than anything.
However, happy to live in a land called Palestine. Instead of Israel.
It's a really good question. So the name isn't important to me. What's important is my people have been massacred in literally every nation with few exceptions. And so my people need, one, a place of refuge. The second aspect of that is I believe in the right of self-determination for indigenous peoples. So I believe that the Kurds should get a state. I believe that England shouldn't be taken away, Great Britain shouldn't be taken away from the British.
And rightful redress.
Exactly. So African countries are all like modern innovations. So I think your idea of Pan-Africanism is much better than what we have at the moment, which is like arbitrary borders around. So my belief is that indigenous people have a right to a land, and because we've been persecuted so viciously, and we're not the only people that have been persecuted, but ours is one of pain. Our history is one of pain. We have a right to a homeland in that region. Now, in terms of a Palestinian state, two-state solution, I would support a two-state solution on the condition the Palestinian Authority change their charter, which currently says in Article 6 that any Jews that weren't living there before the Zionist conquest will be ethnically cleansed from the land. I don't think Jews should be kicked out of any nation because they're Jewish. Nearly 20% of Israelis are Arabs, and they have every right to live there and every right to citizenship. Similarly, if there was a Palestinian state, every Jew should have a right to Palestinian citizenship, which they don't have at the moment. So all these solutions are incredibly complex. Anyone that says it's simple is an idiot or a liar. It's like massively complex. But the most important thing is not dwelling on the past, but dwelling on how do we make meaningful peace for the people that live there. Most Palestinians are good people, most Israelis are good people, and that's the bottom line.
Just one little question on this point, and then Palestine right now as it exists is like, if you look at the map, it's like one little piece of it over here, a little kind of strips over there, separated in between by all of Israel. Like, how would that work?
It's a great question. So first thing to address is these little lands. So what happened was you had the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman was a Muslim empire. It was the second largest empire, I think, ever in history. They controlled most of the world. When they were defeated in World War I, the land went to the colonizers, as they call the British, the Allies. And everybody looks at these people like they're baddies. They were goodies. What the British said, what the Allies said, they said, we believe in the right to self-determination for the people that live here. We're going to tempt. But even with Africa later, it was the same mentality. But I'll just try and finish my point, and then we can come back to Africa. They said that, for instance, we'll take the lands of Iraq, we'll take Lebanon, we'll take Syria, we'll take Jordan, we'll take Israel. Jordan didn't exist then. And they basically said we'll give the people who are indigenous to these lands their own nation. We're not going to keep it for ourselves like other empires have done historically. We're going to give the land back to the people who are indigenous there. Now, they were given mandate over something called mandatory Palestine, British mandatory Palestine, on the condition they create a Jewish national home there because the Jews were indigenous to the land. And the first thing they did, they gave the majority of the land to Jordan. They created the Arabs. They gave a foreign Arab family from Saudi Arabia called the Hashemites. They gave them Jordan. So these are foreigners. They're not indigenous to the land. They gave them a country which they called Jordan. That was supposed to all be part of the Jewish national home. And so what then happened was the remainder should have been the Jewish state. But again, there was another civil war, and it was further divided. The UN proposed the partition in 1947, which is basically what you're describing. It has got a bit smaller since then, the Palestinian areas. And that proposal was offered, and that was the two-state solution. But Israel, what most people don't realise, has given away more land than it actually had. Now, in terms of how do you have a state which is separated, I'll point you to a map. Everyone knows North America. So North America is USA, United States of America, Canada, and then separated from over here is Alaska, with Canada in between. Yeah, it's still somehow part of America, so you can make things work. What needs to happen for Gaza and the West Bank to become a Palestinian state, there needs to be really good relationships between Palestinians and Israelis. And so you have to have really good relations between Israelis and Palestinians. Otherwise, it's never going to work because you need to have transportation between the two areas. You need
Okay, cool. So I just wanted to ask about that. Cool, you explain how it can work, but I think it's very difficult. But how does it come about? Because as far as I understand, you explained a little bit about the Ottoman Empire and so on.
Yeah.
Zionism as a concept has been around for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah.
And originally, I understand that Uganda was the place where Israel was.
So again, there's a lot of, because it's such a complex history, people get facts muddled, and so the Uganda plan, which was actually Kenya, but it's called the Uganda plan, was basically the Zionist, the early. So Zionism, as you said, is a much older thing. Judaism, all Jews pray 3 times a day to return to Jerusalem and rebuild Jerusalem. Like the holidays will say like next year in Jerusalem. So next year we'll celebrate this, not in London, this festival, but we'll celebrate in Jerusalem. Jews for 2,000 years have prayed to return. So the concept of Jews going back to the ancestral land is like a fundamental to the Jewish religion. However, the political movement of Zionism is a largely 19th century was when it was born, or is it was the manifestation of this idea was the 19th century. And what happened was they wanted to go back to Israel. The British said, we can give you somewhere in Uganda or Kenya, which became the Ugandan plan, and the Zionists went back and they discussed it at their national convent. All the Zionists got together once, I think it was once a year, maybe it was more frequently than that, and they discussed should we go to Uganda or Kenya, and they said absolutely not, we've got no ancestral claim there. We're not, despite what you were saying before about Africans being Africa, we're not in, it's not where our origin is. If you go to Israel, literally the history is everywhere. We're digging up synagogues and ancient Hebrew artifacts. There's no disputing the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. It's irrefutable. Like, only a fool would try and argue otherwise. Whereas Uganda, Kenya, like we're not from there, so it's
Fair enough. Good point. Now, anti-Semitism, or what anti-Semitism is. Because given all of that, I would say it is very legitimate, or it's even necessary for people to question the existence of Israel.
I think,
without being called anti-Semitism. Actually, to call someone anti-Semitic and question what I'm just questioning you is actually just shutting down conversation.
So it's a really good point. My response would be the following. If you're an anarchist and you don't believe in any state, you think states are a bad idea and they oppress people, nations oppress people, and you want one world, no borders, then if you're opposed, of course you're going to be opposed to the Jews having a state because you're opposed to all states. But if you're in favour of nations and you support the British having a British nation, you support the Germans having a German nation, and you single out the Jewish state and question that, then many people, probably myself included, would question your motives. And I think it's because I think the reason there is such hostility to the Jews having a state in that region is because of Al-Quds or Jerusalem, because you've got Masjid Al-Aqsa, which is, according to Muslims, the third holiest site in their religion. I think if we were fighting over Portugal, which nobody would care. But if we were fighting over, like, Africa is ripped apart by war every single day. Like, the people are getting slaughtered in Africa every day. Nobody says a word about it. Nobody knows African leaders. Nobody knows the different factions. Like, obviously you do because you're interested. But like, if you take the average person on the British street and ask them to point to Benin on a map, Benin is that a form of cancer? What is Benin? They don't know. They don't know African countries. Never mind who's ruling them, who's fighting in them. And the reason the world knows about Israel-Palestine is because it's very important to Muslims.
And a lot of people.
And Christians as well, and Jews. Yeah. Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah, I agree with that.
But what were you? I agree with that. As a Pan-Africanist, I would say I question all African states and their borders and whether they exist and why they exist. So therefore, questioning states is just part of politics, isn't it? And so the question of Israel is fundamentally just a natural part of politics. The question whether that state particularly should exist, given its history, only existed for the past 100 years.
So let me give you the perfect example of why in most cases it is. Most people who are opposed to a Jewish state there support a Palestinian state there. So what they will say that a Palestinian state, we support the right for the Palestinian people to have a state because they lived in that land. Now the Jews also lived in that land. So if you support a Palestinian state, but not a Jewish state, we begin to gain the question, why? Why are you denying the Jews a right to a nation when nobody's questioning, like literally 100 years ago, none of the states around Israel existed. They were all created by the colonial powers who gave the right to self-determination to the different people living in that land.
Is a distinction not made though? From my observation, there is a distinction made from the original, the Jews who were on the land before the migration, and the Jews who came from Poland, Germany, and so on.
So the majority of Jews, that again, it's another misunderstanding. I stand out in Israel. Why? Because I'm a light-skinned brother. Like, the majority of Israelis are much darker than me. They come from the Middle East and North Africa. So the Ottoman Empire was divided and given the Hashemite family from Saudi Arabia basically got most of the Ottoman land. They're a tiny family, they're foreigners, they don't belong in Jordan, they didn't belong in Syria, they got Syria for a while. They were given all this land.
Like the Israelis.
Can we just kind of finish my point? They were given all this land and nobody questions them. There's no movement for free Jordan. There's no Jordanian solidarity campaign or people fighting to get these. And so to bring it back to what you're saying, I kind of lost myself in the conversation. What did you say?
So what I was saying, so basically, you know that before the European Jews moved to the Jerusalem, there was actually indigenous Jews.
Sorry, that's a great point.
Historically might have been.
So what I was trying to say, so the Ottoman Empire collapsed,
Yeah.
and the people who lived in the Ottoman Empire, the Jews were one of those nations. The Jews were one of those people. Muslims, Christians, and everyone else got land, and the Jews were given this tiny sliver of land in a place that they historically lived in. There were still many of them that lived there to that day, and the majority of Jews today don't descend from European Jews, like most people in Speaker's Corner mistakenly believe. They descend from the Jews from the Ottoman Empire. Now, Palestinians and Jews moved en masse to Israel, to the West Bank, to Gaza, between the years 1882 and 1946. We know that because the Ottomans took a census in 1882 and found there were 270,000 Muslims living there. By 1946, that had swelled to 1.26 million. It was the largest Muslim population explosion in the world during that period, and they were attracted there because of the economic prosperity that the British and the Jews brought. So Jews and Muslims moved from the region. Almost the most common surnames amongst Palestinians are things like Al-Masri, the Egyptian, Al-Maghrebi, Al-Saud, all these names which aren't, they basically describe the land people came from.
Between European Jews and the Jews who were in the Middle East?
Not by Jews, but by...
And I think that's where the confusion comes from, because a lot of things I've heard is about people from Poland and Germany going there and having the same rights as the people, regardless of Jewish or Palestine, being there. Does that make sense? To see me, you can go.
This gentleman here is a Pan-Africanist. Yeah, hopefully I said that right. Pan-Africanist. Now, which country were you born in?
Right here.
Yeah. But you descend from how far? Like, when did your parents?
Pardon?
First, when did they leave Africa?
Europeans going to the Middle East.
It could be 200 years, could be 400 years, you don't know. But at some point, you have a strong suspicion based on your family lineage that they were in Africa. Yet you have a strong connection to that land and a desire to go back, and many Pan-Africanists have gone back. Similarly, the Palestinians that are living outside of the land, they also, many of them have a strong desire. Many of them have a strong desire, Palestinians, to return back to the land, those that are outside of it. And so the question is, when does that desire... Sorry, let me rephrase. The question ended that area. When is too long? So the Jews have a collective memory, whether they're living in Poland, Yemen, or Jerusalem. They have a collective memory that we came from that land, and we have a strong yearning to return to that land. Some stayed there, some left, and most left the land. Now, not only do we have a strong yearning, we have strong archaeological evidence. It's everywhere, all over Israel, that the Jews were there. Now, so for me, is when the right for self-determination was granted to the Jewish people in that land, it is up to those people to determine who can live there, who can't. Just like the British have the right to set their immigration policy. Now, largely born out of the persecution of Jews around the world by different nations, be it Muslim, Christian, whomever, we were slaughtered wholesale. What they did, they set up a law which was actually based on Nazi, not Jewish law, on Nazi law, which said the Nazis would kill anyone that had a Jewish grandparent. So the Jewish state said anyone who has a Jewish state said anyone who has a Jewish grandparent has the right to move here to escape persecution. So halakhically, which is by Jewish law, they're not considered Jews, yet in a bizarre twist of fate, we've let our definition of the state be determined by Nazis so that we can save and rescue Jews.
So I think that maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, you were kind of suggesting that Jews from European descent perhaps have less of a right to certain...
It's just pro-Israeli propaganda.
Well, I don't know.
There's no difference between ISIS and Israel except European support. That's it. Anyone who says otherwise is crazy.
So what I would say, and a lot of people often say that, maybe you won't say, but a lot of people often say that. So what I would say in response is that a lot of black people were removed from Africa 400 years ago. But you wouldn't say that those people who were removed from Africa 400 years ago, black people, no longer have a right to that land or that land.
I wouldn't say it. No, definitely. But to make it make more sense in the context of the conversation, I think what we're trying to establish is why is it that the European Jews might be catching a particular kind of discrimination opposed to say others, right? That's where I'm going, right? Well, anyway, really. Right? But before we get there, what I'm saying is we were trying to identify different types of Jews, right? So right now we have Nigerians and Jamaicans. We understand at one point the Jamaicans might have been in Nigeria, right? Because of the transatlantic slave trade, unfortunately, went somewhere else. So what we're trying to establish is that connection between the land, right? So that's where the conversation is going.
So it's actually where we started. So what happened was the Jews were taken out of Israel by the Romans. And this is where the most Ashkenazim, we believe, came from. They were taken to Italy as captives, and if you go to Rome, you can see Titus's Arch, which has like the engraving that the Romans, where they plundered Jerusalem and took away the menorah, the candelabrum. And so Jewish slaves were taken to Italy. From Italy, they then migrated north into Germany, Poland, and the rest of Europe. So that's how we came to be in Europe largely. We were taken on ships, not too dissimilar to the history of how Africans came to be in America. And so we were taken as war captives, as slaves. We were enslaved by the Romans. We were hunted in their colosseums for sport. We also have a horrible history of persecution, both of our people. And so to his point is we haven't, just like Africans, you've got a brother who doesn't know how long ago his family left Africa, yet has a strong connection with the land. So much so that when I asked him, he's a Muslim? Is that okay? He's a Muslim, but when I asked you why you're here, it wasn't Islam, it's like I'm a Pan-Africanist. And so that's like your driving, and so it's a huge part of your identity, just like being... Assalamu alaikum. Shalom Aleichem.
It's true, and I see it.
So I think it's an interesting point. I mean, what I was going to say is it's just how our friend here can't pinpoint whether his ancestors were from Nigeria or Ghana or somewhere else in West Africa. You can. Okay, but some people can't.
We can do blood
And Ashkenazi Jews can do blood DNA.
Is that what you find? Do you find that when Ashkenazi Jews do blood DNA, they find that they are
No one's playing games with you, bro.
Particularly through a second Jews called the Cohenim. You can find genetic markers which are called Cohenim, not only from people from Poland, but also from Ethiopia, Jews in Ethiopia, Jews
once again, some might make the distinction between Chinese Jews, Ethiopian Jews, and European Jews. Does that make sense, right? And matter of fact, the Jews might have made a distinction themselves.
We do.
Exactly, right? So this is
But the distinctions we make are based. So the distinction we make is based largely on the Frerite. People mistakenly believe it's based on ethnicity. It isn't. So the Ashkenaz is the Hebrew name for Germany. The Ashkenazim actually aren't necessarily from Germany. They can be from anywhere, but they follow the Frerites and the customs. So the Minhagim, which is the customs, and the Nusach, which is the Frerite of the Ashkenaz community. The Sephardim follow this community. Sephardim is Spain. They follow the customs of the Spanish and Portuguese, and then collectively that's also now described the Jews of the Middle East, because that's Frerite spread east. And so for us, ethnicity has never been that important. What's important is basically the community you descend from, and it comes via the father. And so we have very mixed. So my haplotype, genetically, my haplotype is African and Israeli. It's E1, B1, whatever it is, which is not. It's not a European. It's not. My family, my Jewish family, are Polish. So I've got Ashkenazi DNA. I've also got lots of Irish DNA, a little bit of English DNA. But and then it also says like biblical Israel, which maybe it's Canaanite or something. But my DNA.
What percent connects you to the land of Israel?
So all Ashkenazi DNA, basically a third of my DNA. The bit which isn't Jewish, which it just says like it says Western Middle Eastern, and like basically draws a map around biblical Israel. That was like tiny. It was like 3%. So I would imagine that's. Whereas I've got more European DNA than I have, and that's because most of my great grandparents were European rather than Jewish. But Judaism doesn't work like that. Judaism either comes via the mother or you convert, and so that's why Jews look different in different lands. But we don't define ourselves on.
Can you convert? And then once you convert, you have a stake in Israel. Is that how?
So once you join the Jewish people, then you have a right to live in the Jewish homeland, the Jewish national home. Yeah.
And is it a possibility that a lot of the Zionists in that early century, like the 18th, 19th century, as you said, could have been reverts or converts into Judaism?
No. The overwhelming majority of Jews do not descend from converts. They go all the way, but we have common ancestors. We can trace our DNA all the way back to Israel. But there will have been converts.
Throughout Jewish history in Europe, there were conversions, there were marriages, all that kind of stuff, which is why you have so much of our genetics which belong to other people. That doesn't mean we're any less Jewish.
Many people who try to undermine the Semitic roots of Jews often claim of the Ashkenazi. They like to claim that most Ashkenazi are descended from the Khazars. But the Khazars moved south into the Caucasus, whereas the Ashkenazi, I think they tended to come from Germany and ultimately from Spain,
so basically
via the Rhineland.
So to really reinforce that point, before the Kingdom of Khazaria, there was Jewish Ashkenazi communities in Europe. So we have ancient cemeteries, we have ancient communities that long predate Khazaria. So it's one of those. It's usually used by people who want to attack the idea of
the so-called Khazar, if the majority did become Jews,
it's mine. But can I just keep that inside?
You're likely to find their descendants in the Caucasus, the so-called mountain Jews, the Caucasus Jews of Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ossetia.
So in Israel,
these are likely to be descendants from.
How is the power structure in Israel? So who is the ruling elite in Israel?
So what most people, in the same way that if you look at most Western nations, and Jews don't see themselves, we don't divide ourselves into these ethnic categories, but other people do. Right. And so as an example, the poorest community in Israel isn't Ethiopian Jews, it isn't say Arabs. The poorest community in Israel is Haredi, so ultra-Orthodox Jews. So
So they don't work.
not anymore. It used to be. It's not the case anymore. For instance, in education, the group that outperforms anyone else in terms of religious communities are Christian Arabs. And so what people tend to do, they look at the surnames of, say, prime ministers and presidents and say, aha, they're all Ashkenazim. But the reason for the historical legacy of Ashkenazim being in more senior positions was because if you were a Jew coming from Ethiopia, your education will have been very limited. If you were a Jew that was coming from, let's say, Germany, your education, your life experiences pre-coming there would have been incredibly, far more developed than your Ethiopian cousin. What's gradually happening as everyone comes to the land over the age, over the years, those divisions are becoming less pronounced.
That's not to say we have to. That's not to say that there's no racism. There's a lot of racism.
But we're not talking racism. You're talking about how different communities.
This is where I wanted to go because this is where I step in. This is
The Ashkenazi, being more highly educated, have more opportunities.
Not anymore. Historically, not all Ashkenazis.
So if historically that was the case, that was back in the
So
40s,
Israel's
50s,
only 70 years old.
Still,
So
but
yeah.
that was still back in the days, right? Today, because men have children, women have children,
So
right?
the Ethiopian Jews came over in the 90s.
Okay.
So it's relatively recent.
Why were the Nazis? Why not?
They were persecuted. They were persecuted by Marxists in Ethiopia, and they were rescued by Israel.
But they lived happily in Ethiopia for a while.
To be honest, if you ask almost all Ethiopian Jews, love living in Israel. And I think there's either 800 or, I think there's 800 Jews left in Ethiopia, which my organisation is actively campaigning to bring back to Israel.
A lot of them were refugees. I mean, refugees in the way we would understand. I've got Ethiopian friends who literally up sticks and walked from Ethiopia to Israel. A lot of them are orphans now. Their parents, one or more parents died along the way. It was a huge national effort in Israel to airlift a huge number over as well. So
Was there a delay process on bringing them to Israel?
there was a crisis in Ethiopia at that time. And that's
So
why
he's asking.
Israel's fine. They didn't go straight to Ethiopia.
So to answer your question, there was a question, a religious question, which was answered whether they are Jews. And the leader of the Sephardi community, so the Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, he ruled that they are categorically Jewish. Like there's no doubt. They went through what was called Gerut Lachumra, just to be sure, because their traditions were very different to the wider Jewish community. They didn't have, for instance, the oral tradition because they went to Ethiopia before the Babylonian exile, before we codified all of the oral law, which all normative Jews follow today. And so there was definitely questions: are they Jewish? And the Jews ruled that. Most Jews ruled that they are. There are still, to be honest, truthfully, there are still small communities of ultra-Orthodox Jews that don't recognise them as Jewish, and I believe they're wrong. They're absolutely wrong. Ethiopian Jews are as Jewish as any other Jew.
There are also Ethiopian historians who undermine their Jewishness. For example, in the Cambridge history of Africa, several Ethiopian scholars undermine their Jewishness by pointing out that they became Judaized simply because Ethiopia was cut off from the mainstream Christendom as a result of the Islamic domination of Egypt and the Middle East, and they developed Judaic ideas and a Judaic mythology to set themselves apart from other Christians, and they then developed the notion that they are the tribe of Israel. This is like Ethiopian historians who
just going to say, and that's why Ovadia Yosef, the chief rabbi of the Sephardim, he ruled that there had to be a Gerut Lechumra, which is like a conversion, just to be careful, which is usually if you convert to Judaism, it takes 3 to 7 years. It can take a long time. But for the Ethiopian community, it was instant, just because their traditions were so different from widespread. Just to make sure, so no one could ever question whether they're Jewish or not. And there was what's called the Gerut Lechumra.
So what is spearheading the mistreatment of some of the Ethiopian?
I don't believe there is that. There's racism in Israel, just like there's racism here. You have the EDL, you have far-right movements here.
What is pushing?
So what was trying to say? So I believe that the majority racism that exists in Israel today isn't targeted at Ethiopian Jews. It's targeted at Sudanese asylum seekers and refugees and economic migrants, but migrants who are coming from Africa who aren't Jewish. Largely the Ethiopian Jews while they may not be yet as in the same socio-economic bracket as say this, for the reasons we said, they came there in the 90s, so they haven't yet had time. They're not like 2, 3, 4 generations in of like Israeli education. I didn't say inshallah, I'm talking to the wrong crowd. In Yitz Hashem, that will happen in the very near future. We'll see that balancing out.
What about Moroccan Jews? Moroccan Jews have been there for a long time, and they're economically and socially marginalised in Israel.
So I would say
they represent a high proportion of criminal activity within the Jewish community within Israel is by Moroccan Jews who are marginalised economically and socially, and they've been there since I don't know the 60s. 70s.
So what's he saying? Is that correct?
So is that right?
Half right and half not right. So historically, I believe that many of the early socialist European Jews that came over had negative images of the Jews from North Africa, and there was definitely persecution, not persecution, but discrimination in the early days.
So by the ruling elite.
And then you have like racial slurs which are used to.
Let me just jump in. I mean, so I want to talk to you about Israel, Zionism, and the whole idea behind it as a whole. But I want to I just want to put out there that's what I want to talk about. But if you guys want to talk about the racial dynamics of Israel, I'll let you guys finish that conversation.
No, go ahead.
You were here first. You were here first.
I just want to say, like, with Israel and the ideology of Zionism, Israel is getting their homeland. Now you have the homeland. I just want to ask like, my feelings about the question around anti-Semitism. So I asked you a series of questions that if I asked them in a different way or as seen differently, they would have been seen as anti-Semitism. It would have been seen as me questioning the right of Israel to survive. And like I said, I feel like there seems to almost be like a very, you can't criticize or even talk about the Israeli state or the Jewish state without almost erring onto that into that area of anti-Semitism. I would say, if I was to take this position, and this is what I'm going to take right now, I believe Israel, as holding the nuclear weapons and as having a more sophisticated economy than all of its neighbours, it should take the higher road in dealing with its neighbours. Would that be an anti-Semitic statement?
No, and I think it does take the moral. I think it does take the moral. I think if you look at its neighbour, look at Syria. Look at Syria. Yeah, Syria's next door to Israel. What's Bashar al-Assad doing to Bashar the butcher? What's he doing to the Muslims?
Yeah, for sure, he's a butcher, just like you said.
What are Daesh doing?
Butchering Muslims. Yeah.
Like literally, you look at all the states that surround Israel. Israel operates at a far higher level. When Israel goes